One such rancher named Charles Goodnight did just that. He was able to incorporate cattle genetics from Europe to help improve his cattle herd in the many ranches that he owned. Charles Goodnight is known as the father of the Panhandle because of his ranching experience. But he also met up with another man named Oliver Loving, and they gathered and drove cattle north through New Mexico along the Goodnight-Loving Trail. It is rumored that Mr. Goodnight even invented the chuck wagon to make the drive more accessible to food for all of the cowboys and the crew that went along. He also had many ranches, including the famous J.A. Ranch in the Palo Duro Canyon. After his time on long cattle drives, he learned and used genetics as a tool to make his cattle better. Here is a map of some of the famous cattle trails. So as you see this map right here, you can see where the J.A. Ranch is right here. And if you look at the legend, the squares are a lot of the famous cattle ranches that would have been around in the late 1800s. As you can also see, the blue represents rivers, famous rivers. There was also, of course, the Red River and the Rio Grande River down here. Now, today, we see a lot more urbanization through this area, but back then it was just a lot of cattle roaming around, and there were even times that a lot of buffalo roamed this area. But they would start to put cattle together. This is where a fort existed, and they would start to put cattle together at those forts, and then they would drive the cattle. This is the Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving Trail right here. So they drove those cattle along this trail all the way up to Denver and then even up into Cheyenne, Wyoming, so that they could meet the railroads and send the cattle back east. Now the railroads had cars that were mainly made out of wood, and they had slats in them so that the cattle still had plenty of air as they went on their drive back east. But now what I want to do is I want to stop right here and let's make an inference. So why do you think that the Goodnight Loving Trail went this way instead of just going straight up through the Texas Panhandle? Well, I would infer that because there is a river here, they decided to come this way through New Mexico instead. Because cattle not only eat grass, but they also have to have water to drink. And a lot of times, if cattle were moved from this area straight up, they would find that there was not enough water reservoir for their cattle to drink, and those cattle would not make it. So this particular place, I think that this is why they went this way instead. You can also see the Great Western Trail right here that went up and met the train at Dodge City. And then the Chisholm Trail, also another famous cattle trail that went up through Oklahoma into Abilene and other parts up into Kansas City. So cowboys would gather cattle all across the state of Texas, and they would put these big groups together, and they would drive these cattle hundreds of miles and over treacherous terrain and sometimes unfriendly territories, which made for a pretty interesting time in the Wild West.